everyone. Welcome to United Synagogue's Lunch and Learn. It's great to be back here. It's been quite a while since my last series here, giving series on Treyasar and Tehillim, and it's great to be back here doing a pre-Purim mini-series where we're going to be looking at the heroes and the villains of the Purim story. And just to begin, I want us to do a really quick summary of the Purim story so that we're all on the same page. We have the really exciting and quite riveting story of King Ahasuerus, the king of the Persian Empire, who begins the story with a banquet, and he's celebrating, and he has a bit of a run-in with his wife Vashti, and she is banished, and then he really still wants a new wife, and there's this sort of beauty contest of sorts where he chooses Esther, a Jewish young woman, to be his new queen, the new queen of the Persian Empire, although he does not know that she's Jewish. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, we have a showdown between Haman, the sort of prime minister of the Persian Empire, and Mordechai, who is Esther's uncle and a very important Jewish man in the story who we're going to be looking into in detail. They have a bit of a showdown where Haman wants people to bow down to him. Mordechai refuses, and that causes Haman to get very, very angry. And he decides that he wants to bring about the annihilation of the Jewish people. We also see Mordechai, there's all these sub-stories you see in the background at the same time as a side story. Mordechai happens to overhear an assassination plot of Bigtan and Teresh, two Persian men who want to kill Ahasuerus the king, and he sends word to Ahasuerus, so these people are executed and the king's life is saved. So we have all these things going on in the background. Meanwhile, Esther has been queen for a number of years, and Mordechai says, you are in the place to save the Jewish people, and she brings about somehow, we'll go into this in a lot more detail, she essentially gets her husband to agree that the Jewish people should not be killed, and Haman ends up being executed, and there is a big battle between the Jewish people and their enemies, but essentially the Jewish people are saved. And we see the Purim story, the Megillah, ending with the enactment that Purim should be celebrated every year in various ways, which we do celebrate Purim today. And one of the things we do every year on Purim is we hear the Megillah reading. This story is read out loud for everyone to hear twice on Purim. And as a child, I always remember listening in anticipation and excitement with my Gregor, my noisemaker, ready to drown out the name of the wicked man Haman, to boo and stamp my feet and make lots of noise when the arch enemy of the Jewish people was mentioned, because we had this tradition to blot out his name. And actually, it always felt like a really, really long wait until we got to that first Haman. As a child, it felt like a very long time. But I actually never realized where this comes from. This is codified in our halacha. If we look now at our first source on my shared screen here, if I share my screen, you can see the Shulchan Aruch states that one must say, cursed is Haman, blessed is Mordechai, that we are meant to curse the baddies of the story and bless the goodies of the story. And it continues to say that we should say, cursed is Zeresh, that's Haman's wife, blessed is Esther, and cursed are all those who worship idols, and blessed all of Israel. And then we sort of have this addendum here, this addition, and one must also say, Charvona, may he be remembered for the good. And Charvona is always a sort of, well, who is he? We'll talk about him soon. But the idea is, this is discussed in the Gemara and in the Midrash and in Shulchan Aruch, that we see that there's this idea mentioned in Mishlei and Proverbs that the name of the wicked shall rot. And this is really where it comes from, that we want the name of our wicked enemy Haman to rot, to be wiped out. Therefore, we make this noise when we say his name in the Megillah. And actually, we fulfill this obligation also when we say the this song. There's this song that we say at the end of the Megillah. Now, I don't know how many of you even noticed, because really, by the time we've had the Megillah reading, we're already thinking about the next Purim jobs that we have to rush off to deliver the Mishloach Manot and sit in traffic for ages getting into Golders Green. And especially this year with the roadworks between on Shire Hall, it's going to be a bit of a nightmare getting from Hendon to Golders Green and so on. And we're already thinking about cooking for our Purim Suda and getting everything ready, and we want to get on with our day. But there is this song that we're meant to recite after we hear the Megillah, and most people just sort of mumble it quietly to themselves. And at the end, there is this part that we sing, Shoshanat Yaakov, in a kind of joyful, upbeat tune, which is really a nice song. And at the end of it, we're quoting almost word for word what I just read for you from the Shulchan Aruch, because we say, "Cursed be Haman, who sought to destroy me, and blessed be Mordechai the Jew, cursed be Zeresh, blessed is Esther," and at the end, V'gam Chavana Zachor Latov, and also Chavana we should remember for the good. And we're going to come to who this Chavana is later. But the point is, the reason I'm beginning with this is because I've chosen to talk about the heroes and the villains of the Purim story. And I haven't just chosen this because it's a fun thing to talk about, but because we see in our halacha that we are meant to know who the goodies and the baddies of the Purim story are, and not only know who they are, but bless them and curse them accordingly. And that is really why I've chosen to talk to you about this today and also next Tuesday. And today we're going to look at the heroes of the story. We're going to talk about three characters: Esther, Mordechai, and this Charvona man that we mention in this song. Next week, we'll talk about Haman and Zeresh and possibly Achashverosh. We'll talk about the villains next week. So who are the heroes of the Purim story? And I want to begin with the question of what is a hero anyway? Because when we think of hero, we think of, supermen and superheroes with capes flying around saving us. And obviously that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about the protagonist of the story, the person who drives the story forward, perhaps the one who sacrifices and makes sacrifices for the greater good of the people, yes. But this quote that I really wanted that you can see here, it's also someone who is significantly highlighted and whose actions, fate, and inner world occupy the reader's attention, sometimes also arousing his sympathy. So that's something we need to think about as we're listening to the Megillah on Purim. Who is it that I'm being made to think about the most? Who is it that I feel the most sympathy for and the most connection with? Because that is possibly the hero of the story. So as I said, we're going to talk about Esther, then Mordechai, and then Chavana. So let's begin now with Esther. Now, Esther is introduced to us as an orphan who is adopted by her uncle Mordechai. And the Gemara actually discusses that they were not just uncle and niece, but also they got married later on. And really, that's a discussion for another time, but we can certainly see love and affection between them. And clearly, she's the one who essentially saves the Jewish people. She's the one that inside it in the palace who's able to say to the king, "My people are in danger, you need to save them." And he agrees. And that's, we could end this shir right now and say Esther's the heroine, end of story. And what greater proof than the fact that the Megillah is named after her. We don't read Megillat Mordechai, we read Megillat Esther. It's named after her for a reason, because she is the heroine of the story. But obviously there's a lot more going on here. So let's go into Esther a bit more in detail. And I want to say that actually, I think Esther gets a bit of a raw deal in modern times, because yes, traditionally she always has been seen as the heroine, but there's been this sort of modern reading of Esther. Maybe some of you haven't heard of it, but I think it's important to share it and bring it to light, because it is being discussed in some ways. That recently, as a result of important sociological and political changes, people have started to accuse Esther of being too passive, too submissive to the men ruling her. And they say she should have spoken out and taken a stand earlier against what was going on. And they contrast her to Vashti, who is now seen as sort of standing up against the abuse of women. Now, I don't have time to get into Vashti and her whole story. It's fascinating, and I'd love to give a share on it another time. But I want to address this modern take of Esther because, you know, separating her from Vashti, and maybe there are certain elements that we can praise in Vashti, Esther, we need to look at her separately. And I don't think we can criticize her submissive nature without truly understanding. And by the way, I'm not saying I agree that she's submissive, but we can't criticize her without truly understanding the sacrifices or the difficulties and the situation she was truly in, because essentially she didn't really have a choice. What do I mean by this? Well, she was married to Ahasuerus against her will. I think we have a very romanticized view of it. Oh, isn't it amazing to join the royal family? Wouldn't it be amazing? It's every girl's dream, like a Disney film, to discover that she can join a royal family and marry a king or a prince. And wouldn't that be lovely? But it's not like it is in the 21st century where it might be like that if you marry into the royal family. Ancient Persia was not like that. And really Esther, her position as the queen didn't give her much by way of a freedom. And what do I mean by that? Well, essentially she was married against her will, because if you look here, we can see that in Esther chapter 2, verse 8, it says there, and we'll just look at the second part of this verse where I've highlighted it in the yellow, V'tilakach Esther el Beit HaMelech, and Esther was taken to the king's palace. She didn't volunteer, she didn't go off her own accord, she was taken. And the Targum, the Aramaic translation of our Bible, and we know there's no such thing as translation without interpretation, he translates this as ba'unsa, by force. We know in modern Hebrew the word ones means rape. It was against her will. She was taken. And the Malbim, our commentator, takes it a bit further. He explains this double lashon. If you look, the double expression here that I've underlined of Dvar HaMelech V'dato, that there was this king's order and an edict to gather the maidens to the capital city of Shushan. Well, why do we need an order and an edict? Why both? Why not just one of them? So the Malbim explains that at first the king sent out an order that the women, the young ladies, should come off, they should volunteer, they should come off their own accord. But maybe not enough came, or maybe he wasn't pleased with the ones that came and he wanted more to come. And therefore he issued an edict that which carried the death penalty, that all eligible young girls, meaning anyone who, anyone eligible, should come to the palace on pain of death if they didn't. And the Malbim says that girls were gathered from all over the Persian Empire, meaning that it would have been really, really serious if a Shushan family in the capital city were found to be hiding a girl who was eligible. And therefore, they really didn't have a choice. They had to send her into the palace. And it really wasn't by choice. And we see that Esther's quite a passive character. It says she was taken twice. She was crowned. I've got an image for you here on the slide of her being crowned as Queen of Persia. But she's incredibly passive in this beginning section. And we don't even hear her speak until halfway through chapter 4 of our 10 chapters. So for a large part, nearly half of the Megillah, she's not really so active at all. And we see that she's taken to this foreign environment. And by the way, she doesn't tell anyone that she's Jewish. Mordechai tells her to hide her Jewish identity. She's not allowed out. She doesn't have the freedom to go back and speak to her uncle or get advice or see any loved ones. She's kept in the palace. And however, we see this really beautiful midrash, I think really gives us an insight into her heroic nature. There is an idea that chapter 22 of Tehillim, of the book of Psalms, is attributed to Esther, that when she was in her loneliness and alone in the palace, she cried out to God saying, God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you left me in this way? And the midrash questions why it says, my God, Kaylee, 3 times at the beginning of this chapter of Tehillim. And the midrash explains because Esther was implying to the Holy One, blessed is he, Master of the universe, 3 commandments you gave me. You gave me, and she mentions the 3 female commandments of Nida, of the laws of family purity, of Challah, the idea of separating some of the challah dough before you bake it, and lighting Shabbat candles. She says, you gave me 3 commandments, and even though I'm in the house of this wicked man, have I transgressed any one of them, she asks. She's saying, even though I've been put alone into this materialistic and paganistic palace where I don't have the freedom and I'm the only Jew here, yet I'm trying my hardest to keep the Torah. And okay, practically what that means, I don't know. Maybe she wanted to, so it was as if she kept it. Maybe she lit Shabbat candles in a closed cupboard the way the Moranos did in Spain. I don't know what it means, but I know it means she wanted to. She had that connection to Torah and Yiddishkeit despite her difficult environment and surroundings. And the final thing that I really want to mention now about Esther and her heroic nature is her response to the crisis. When push came to shove, when she had to, she stood up for what she believed in. She stood up for the Jewish people, even though it was a difficult thing to do. What do I mean? Well, Mordechai goes to her when he hears of Haman's decree to wipe out the Jewish people. And by the way, by this point, she's been in the Megillah, she's been queen, I believe, for 5 or more years. We think when we read it in the space of about 30 to 40, 45 maybe minutes on Purim morning, we think that everything happened within the space of 1 year. But if you pay attention, it mentions dates. And it was a while later that this event came. She wasn't a new queen. She'd been there already for a few years, settled into her role. And Mordechai sends her a message, because remember, they can't see each other, so this is all by messenger. And he tells her that Haman has got the king to approve the wiping out of the Jewish people. You have to go to your husband, the king, and ask him for mercy, ask him to save the Jewish people. And she says, I can't go to the king uninvited. I can't go to the king if I haven't been invited. And by the way, that in itself shows us the difficulty of her situation as the queen of Persia. She didn't have the ear of the king. She didn't have the freedom to go anywhere in the palace that she wanted. If she went to see her husband when he didn't invite her to come, she could be given the death penalty. So that really shows how difficult it was, and that it wasn't a dream that we should all sort of romanticize being the Persian queen in ancient times. But Mordechai prevails, and these words that I'm going to share with you now that are highlighted in green on your screen are really, they give me goosebumps still every time I hear them on Purim, because they really are so powerful and chilling. Mordechai said to Esther, again by messenger, do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silence in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. He's saying to her, if you don't want to do anything, fine. The Jewish people will be saved. He has faith that God will save the Jews. But he says it was for this reason that you became queen. And Esther's response is, fine. Go and assemble everyone to fast on my behalf, and I will go to the king. And if I perish, I will perish. She says, fine, I'll accept my fate. I will try. But still, we're sort of in suspense, because is she really going to go? I mean, how many of us say we're going to do things and then actually never go through with it and never do it? Maybe she'll chicken out. Maybe she won't go. We also know, if we go back to the point I mentioned earlier, that there's an opinion in the Gemara that she was married to Mordechai. So there's a whole discussion about that, what that meant, that she was married to Mordechai and then married to Achashverosh. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the Gemara says that if as soon as she willingly goes to Achashverosh, she could no longer return to her marriage with Mordechai. So she knows, and Mordechai knows when he asks her to do this, and she knows when she agrees to do it, that if she goes willingly to Achashverosh, she's giving up her marriage, her home, any hope of happiness in the future. So we wait in suspense, and then we see chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, V'yehi b'yom hashlishi, it was after the 3 days of fasting, V'tilabash Esther malchut. She dresses in her royal clothes, almost her armor. She knows that to go to Achashverosh to ask this favor, she has to go with all of the power she holds, which is her power as the Queen of Persia, with her charm, with her beauty, with her grace, with her royal clothes. She goes to him and she takes that chance. And here the painting that I've put for you on the screen is of her going to him at this moment and him holding out his scepter, showing that she is welcome to come to him. And she goes and she rises to the challenge. She understands that her position, her charm, her beauty, and her charisma that God gave her at birth were all for this moment, so that she could be the savior of the Jewish people, or at least attempt it. She doesn't know she's going to succeed, but she attempts it at this moment with all of her being to request the safety of her people. She understands that her suffering, her sacrifices, giving up her own love, her own family, her own happiness were all worth it for the greater good of her people. And thus, once we've understood the hardships that Esther has faced, only then can we truly understand her greatness, both the sacrifices that she's made and the bravery and the courage that she shows. And we see that from this point, her role changes. I've said up till now she was incredibly passive, but now she takes the active role. And we see that in chapter 4, verse 14, it says that Mordechai went and did all that Esther commanded, because now she's the one making this decision. She's the one telling him what to do. Previously, it was Mordechai telling her and her obeying, and now the roles have reversed, which is something we'll come back to talking about soon. Because from here onwards, she's the one driving the plot forward. She's the one that invites the king and Haman to a banquet. She's the one that causes events that lead to Haman's execution. She's the one that writes letters and decides what's going to be written in them, and so on. So we see that Esther, she changes very much. She goes from this passive, quiet character to this very active, heroic, brave character as the Megillah goes on. Now I would like to talk to you about Mordechai. Mordechai, even from his introduction, we can see that he is an important character and clearly one of the main protagonists. He is introduced as Ish Yehudi Haya b'Shushan Habira, Ushmo Mordechai. There was this Jewish man in Shushan, the capital city, and his name was Mordechai. This sort of long introduction is used in Tanakh to introduce someone important. For example, Eov is described in this way, so that already signifies that he's important. And we also see something interesting. Normally in Tanakh, it says, someone, the son of someone else. And that's how they're introduced. But here we have a number of generations. We have Mordechai, Ben Yair, Ben Shimei, Ben Kish. It goes back 3 generations, and then also talks about him being Ishimini, which there's a debate what that means, but it could mean that he's from the tribe of Binyamin or so on. We don't know, but there's a lot of time given to introducing him, which is unusual in Tanakh, unless it's for someone who's very important. So already we see from the introduction that he's important. We also see that Mordechai acts as a Kiddush Hashem. So what do I mean by that? We see that early on in the Megillah, he refuses to bow down to Haman. And Erica Brown, in her fascinating book on the Megillah, on Esther, has a whole chapter which she entitles Mordechai's Dangerous Decision, and where she discusses exactly this. Why is it that Mordechai refuses to bow down? And it's really well worth a read. I highly recommend it. And he says, she discusses that, elsewhere in Tanakh, it's allowed. We see characters bowing down to non-Jewish kings or non-Jewish leaders, and it seems that it's allowed. Why is it that Mordechai refuses to bow down to Haman, especially when it endangers not just Mordechai's life, but the lives of all the Jewish people? Why does he do this? Okay, maybe he didn't know it was going to cause such a issue for the whole of the Jewish people, but still, why does he do this? And this is a big debate, and Chazal, our rabbis in the Gemara, and also many later commentators say it's because Haman was wearing an idol, and to bow down to Haman would be then therefore seen as idolatry, which is one of the three cardinal sins we're not allowed to do. We're meant to give up our life rather than do one of the three cardinal sins. So therefore, that's why Mordechai refused to bow down, because he didn't want to commit idolatry. And even though we can't know for sure if that's the reason or what the reason was, we know that Mordechai is doing it not for a personal grudge against Haman or anything like that. He's doing it because of his Jewish values. What do I mean? If you look at the Esther chapter 3 verse 4, when they spoke to him on a daily basis, it wasn't just once that they asked him to bow down. It was repeated daily that they were hounding him. Mordechai, why aren't you bowing down to Haman? Mordechai, why aren't you bowing down to Haman? And what does he say in the yellow highlighted bit? Ki higid lehem asher hu Yehudi, because Mordechai said, I am a Jew, and Jews don't do this. He believed, so it was for his Torah values, his Jewish identity. He was refusing to bow down, refusing to compromise on his Judaism. So we see him as a heroic character because he's sacrificing things for his Torah values. One other thing I'd like to share about Mordechai is this idea that a protagonist drives a story, as I said earlier. And we see Mordechai really does drive the plot forward. What do I mean? Well, his refusal that we've just discussed to bow down to Haman leads to Haman's plan against the Jewish people. He checks on Esther regularly. He hangs out at the gate of the palace because he wants to hear how's Esther doing. He can't see her. There's no phones. There's no emails. There's no social media to keep up with people. He has no idea what's happening to Esther inside the walls of the palace. So he just hangs out hoping to hear rumors and find out what's going on with her. And he sends messages to her telling her what to do. He's driving the plot forward in that way. He reveals the assassination plot of Bigtan and Teresh that I mentioned earlier against the king, thereby saving the life of King Ahasuerus. And he urges Esther to act. As we saw, Esther originally said, no, there's nothing I can do. And he urges her and manages to convince her to act on Haman's plot against the Jewish people. So we see that he really does drive the plot forward. However, what have I said? All of these things take place in the first 4 chapters of the Megillah alone. There are 10 chapters of the Megillah, and Mordechai drives the plot only in the first 4. What do I mean by that? After that, Esther takes over, just like I said earlier. So we see something really interesting that really, actually, let's skip to this side. Rav Professor Yonatan Grossman, he says, we may state in the narrative of Esther that there are 2 characters who may be regarded as the protagonists. In the first part of the narrative, Mordechai is a protagonist, and in the second part, Esther is the heroine. They take turns. The narrative switches, and they switch roles. But Erica Brown takes it even further, and I really like this idea that it's the partnership, she says, that saves the day, because essentially it's teamwork. They're both the joint heroes of the Purim story. They work together with their strengths, complementing each other. Esther inside the palace, Mordechai outside of the palace, but together they work as a team. And it reminds us of the pasuk in Kohelet Ecclesiastes where we say, Tovim hashnayim min ha'echad. 2 are better off than 1, because it's teamwork that matters. And I think this is such an important lesson for us today in the 21st century to take from Megillat Esther, that it's not about the one person having the power, the one person being the heroic character, but it's about teamwork. And if we can work together, we can be stronger. And we should all really be aware of this in our home life, in our work life, in our community life. We can really make a difference and be stronger when we work together. I want to just mention one more character, as I mentioned earlier. Who is this Charvona? So we said at the beginning of this in this poem, this song that we sing, Shoshanat Yaakov, at the end of hearing the Megillah, we say V'gam Charvona Zachor Latov, and also Charvona should be remembered for the good. And who is he? I mean, he's not a hero in an obvious hero, but the fact that he's mentioned at the same time as we are blessing Mordechai and Esther, who are our heroes, really makes it worthy of a question of who was he and why do we need to remember him for good. Now, he's mentioned twice in the Megillah, but his main role is in the second time he appears, which is in Esther chapter 7, verse 9. And he appears at the sort of climax of the story when, after the big reveal, where Esther says that it's Haman who is the enemy of her people, and she says it's Haman who is trying to destroy her people. And the king, Ahasuerus, gets very angry and he turns around. And as he's turned around, Haman goes and lies on Esther's couch. And when Ahasuerus turns around and sees this, he gets even more angry and he says, and you're going to assault the queen while I'm still in the building? And he gets so angry. And it's at that moment that Charvona speaks. And by the way, the image on your screen here, it's interesting because you can see here someone prostrating himself and begging for mercy before Esther. I imagine that's meant to be Haman. In the Megillah itself, it says that he lies on the sofa on her couch. Obviously, this painting has it a little bit differently, but it's really this climax here that the king is so angry with Haman. And then Charvona opens his mouth, and this is what he says. V'yomer Charvona echad min hasarasim lifnei hamelech. And Charvona spoke, one of the people serving the king, Gam hinei ha'etz asher asa Haman leMordechai asher diber tov al hamelech omed bebeit Haman. By the way, he says, did you know that Haman has just built a gallows of 50 cubits high, which is standing outside Haman's house, ready to be used? And by the way, did you know that Haman built this for Mordechai, who saved your life? And what does the king respond immediately? V'yomer hamelech taluhu alav. Hang him, is what the king says. Hang him. And the next verse tells us that indeed Haman is hung on these same gallows that Haman himself built for Mordechai. And obviously this is all part of the whole concept of v'nahafochu, that everything is turned upon its head. So we see that Charvona speaks up at the right moment, because if he hadn't spoken, maybe Haman would have weaseled his way out of it. Maybe he'd have, spoken out his way out, bribed his way out, managed to escape just with a, life sentence that later would have been lessened to 20 years, then 10 years. And before you know it, in 5 years' time, he's out of jail and walking the streets and able to do harm to them again. But because Charvona spoke, straight away he was executed. And Charvona therefore is praised because he spoke up at the right time. We don't know. He's not Jewish. We don't know why he speaks. There is a midrash that he's Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, but essentially we don't know why he chooses to speak up here. But it makes a big difference. And I think the message that we are meant to remember Charvona for the good is a message that the little things that count. Sometimes we think, who am I? I'm so small. How can I help make a difference with all the problems that are going on in the world? Who am I? So I'm just not going to bother. And Charvona teaches us, no. How do you know? Even saying this sentence had a big, big impact on the Purim story. So too, your small act of kindness or smile or offer to help can make a big, big difference. And I'd just like to take a moment to relate this to the current situation in Ukraine. We may say, we're so far away. Who am I to be able to help? It's such a terrible situation, and there's nothing I can do. But there are countless of things we can do. We can donate items. We can volunteer to pack those items to be sent to the refugees. We can donate money, and essentially we can also pray that there should be a peaceful solution very, very soon. But there are things that we can do, and even those little things can make such a big difference, and we shouldn't say that there is no point in even trying. So just one more mention before we end for today. We must not forget God. when I did a poll on social media to ask who were the villains and the heroes of the Purim story, and most people responded on the hero side that it was Esther and Mordechai, but I did get one response that we should also see Hashem as a hero, and I think that person was spot on. We should not forget God, because essentially, even though his name is missing from the scroll of the Megillah, we know that God is always there running the show behind the scenes, essentially the puppeteer pulling the strings. And Rav Grossman himself says that a human being cannot really be the main character in the full sense of the word, since the main character in the biblical narrative is always God. It is he who generates the plot. Indeed, it is no coincidence that the protagonist of a biblical narrative also has deficiencies and weaknesses. And this is so important for us to remember, because I think in today's modern age, we often get distracted and idolize our heroes and really see them as perfect beings. But we have to remember that every person, no matter how heroic they may be, they still have flaws. And it is only God who is the perfect one worth us, who is worthy of our worship, and we shouldn't be worshipping any human hero, rather only the divine hero. And therefore we also need to remember that God is one of the heroes, or the ultimate hero of the Purim story. So in conclusion, I would like to say that we have seen that Mordechai and Esther take turns as the protagonists, but essentially that they're the joint heroes of the Purim story, teaching us the power of teamwork, and that Charvona provides a really important role that we must not forget, teaching us the power of the little things. And of course, we have to remember that none of it would have happened without God himself, the divine hero, directing things from up above. So just to end off, all I will say is please join us next week for part 2, where we will look at the villains of the story. Please, I'd love to hear from you with comments or questions or suggestions of who the villains are for next week. You can email me, learnwithpnina@gmail.com, and you can also find me on Facebook and Instagram and watch my Torah content there, and be in touch with any questions or comments through social media as well. Thank you so much and have a great day.